For me, the definitions are really important. I define diversity as the presence of different individual and intersecting identities. I think of equity as a commitment, a shared commitment to conditions of fairness in the processes and procedures of an organization. I like to think of inclusion as a commitment to involving and uplifting diverse perspectives.
Hello and welcome. I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me as we revisit a previously recorded conversation originally released in April 2023 with Paul Porter, as we take a communication perspective on diversity, equity, inclusion, and multiculturalism. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Dr. Paul Porter. Paul is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the National Speech and Debate Association. And like me, Paul graduated from Ball State University and was a member of the Ball State speech team. Paul went on to earn his master's in communication and rhetorical studies at Eastern Michigan University and his PhD in educational leadership from Indiana State University. You can read more about Paul and get connected to his work in the show notes. As we revisit this conversation with Paul from April 2023, I find myself reflecting on the importance of embracing and navigating difference of experience, difference of perspective, difference of culture, and difference of story. This is a bit of a teaser, but I just recorded a conversation that's going to come out at the end of the year, and in it, we talked about the discomfort that we feel in moments of tension and how we often take that to be a signal that is a red stoplight, when what we really need is to develop the skills and the confidence, I would say, to see moments of discomfort and dissonance as green lights, moments that require us to lean in and be present. Paul has some really beautiful insight and perspective to share that I'm really happy to be sharing again a year and a half later, because there's still so much work for us to do and so much for us to learn from each other. Before we jump in, I'd love to ask you to take a moment to fill out the survey that you can find in the show notes. As I am thinking about the next season of the podcast, I want to embrace the CMM-ish spirit and invite you to be a co-creator with me. As always, I want to be in dialogue with you, and so I'd love to hear how you're using the podcast, what you're getting out of it, what you want to be getting out of it. Anything you'd like to share, I'd like to hear about. Again, that link is in the show notes for you to participate in the survey and participate in co-creating this podcast for next year. But for now, let's revisit this conversation with Paul.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for being here today.
Abbie, thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you, and it's good to be here. I'm really excited.
I appreciate that, and I've been thinking about our intermittent meetings with each other throughout the past few years and connections, which is all revolving around the speech world. And I don't know if you remember this, but I'm just going to go ahead and start our storytelling with my most prominent memory of you, which is that my senior year of high school, when it was the state tournament, I'd won the past year. I was putting so much pressure on myself for this year. And I'm up on the stage, they're giving out the awards, and I came in fourth, which was so devastating. Not first at the time, now it's whatever. But you came up to me, I think you were the one to hand me my trophy, and you said to me, "You still have nationals," which was just like exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. Since, of course, the other plot line going on in my life at that time was that I'd also had nationals the year before, was looking forward to it again. And that's a time I think about a lot in my life of like all the pressure I put on myself and just the psychology of the competition and that I felt so strongly like if I didn't do well when I came back that next year, that it would like take away from my previous success that I had, which is interesting that I felt like it was so fragile. So then it's funny, you know, to have those 2 years that I think about, and then 4 more years on top of that of doing speech, which adds a lot more layers. But that's definitely my biggest memory of you. I don't know if you remember that.
I do actually. I also remember the second half of that sentiment, and that was after the tournament was over. And you asked me to do some peer coaching with you. And I remember sitting in a room with you at Noblesville High School.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember just saying something along the lines of, I am so happy to be working with you because I've had my fill of working against you. And that was not fun. So when you say that you remember getting fourth in informative speaking,
yep.
I remember thinking, yeah, my kid got sixth.
Hey, that's good perspective. Yeah. My family has given me some good language to understand myself, which is that I have a competitive spirit, as they say. And so
That's
I
fair.
definitely was driven by that. And okay, here's part 2 of that story that's really funny.
Mm-hmm.
The person who did win first at that tournament,
Mm-hmm.
Zev Burton.
Yes.
I just recorded a podcast with him.
Really?
We had a fascinating conversation. So that's funny, full circle moment.
Were there any puns in his conversation?
His whole book is about using humor in like international relationships. So he is certainly, and that's what his speech was, or something was about humor.
It was on puns.
Yeah. So he's stuck with it.
You know, it's the beauty of our activity.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically enough, the theoretical framework that drives your podcast, you know, people make their own meaning. And
yeah,
you know, they get to decide what is important, what isn't. I think is the beauty and the curse
right
of speech and debate is that it is subjective.
Yeah.
And success or failure, however you look at it from a competitive perspective, is really dependent upon how someone else makes meaning of the things that you say. And
mm-hmm.
that can be tough.
No, I remember coaching with you too before nationals, and that was like definitely some of the most meaningful coaching that I'd had. And so I appreciated that. So you've been in the back of my mind, you know, since then. And yeah, now both being alumni of the Ball State speech team.
Chirp.
Well, okay, before we get too much into the world of speech, I've been having my guests kind of introduce themselves instead of me trying to piece together what I know of you.
Sure.
You obviously know your stories better and can maybe pick some to help us understand who you are, considering the context of this conversation. Because obviously we don't get to hear your whole life story in this next hour, but we'll do our best. But yeah, if you could share some stories, help us get to know who is Dr. Paul Porter.
Wow, who is Dr. Paul Porter? I like to think that the funniest story about me actually really does center around my arrival into the world. I was born in October of 1978. And 9 months previously, there was a huge blizzard that hit Indianapolis, which is my hometown. And you ask anybody that's in their 50s on up about the blizzard of 78. Anybody in Indianapolis, you ask them about the blizzard of 78, if they were around for it, they can tell you some stories. My father worked as a stockroom manager for the city of Indianapolis. My mother was a nurse's aide, very blue collar family. You know, I think back then I didn't know what middle income or lower income was. I just knew that I didn't have everything that my friends had, but I had everything that I wanted and needed.
Is that something that you think looking back, or like in the moment you were able to make that distinction?
I think looking back, there were moments that I felt like I had everything. And then there were moments where I felt like I didn't have the things that my friends had. What I didn't have really was the capacity, you know, when you're 8, 9, 10 years old to really balance it all out. And I remember hearing my parents talk about struggles with money and thinking to myself, but I thought we were rich. I mean, I've got these brand new Jordans, or I got a new video game system, or I got a new TV. And I think it was really later on that I realized that I had things because my family worked. My parents worked hard to provide for me. And I think it was much later when I started to read about the idea of parents wanting their children to have more than them. And I do believe it was, maybe 10, 12 years ago. I think at one point millennials were projected to be the first generation that weren't better off than their parents. And that's when, when I started to hear those types of conversations, that's when I started to realize my parents busted their butt because there were things that I wanted and I couldn't have. We couldn't just easily afford. And they worked so hard to make a life of what you would call normalcy for me, which I appreciate so much. My parents had me when they were older in life. My parents had me in their 40s. I think the entirety of my childhood, up until my father passed away when I was 16, I really struggled to make sense of the fact that my parents, I think they were born old souls, they weren't as attuned to the realities of the world or the sense-making process that I had of the world around me. They didn't have that. They didn't see the world the way that I did. There was never that sense of like, my parents are my friends. It was my parents are my parents. They are my guardians. They are my caregivers. These are the two people that, and they would always remind me that they brought me into this world. They will take care of me. They will protect and provide for me. But it's their responsibility to shape me into a human being that's going to go off and hopefully leave this world better, not only than I found it, but than they found it. And I just didn't, I wish I had taken more time to put two and two together to really, in the short time that I had with both my parents, be able to appreciate that. That since losing my father, and I've now met a point where I've been without my dad longer than I've been with him. Anytime I hear conversations, certainly part and parcel with the Black community and the importance of Black male role models, the influence and the affect of the presence of a Black father on a Black man, I always take some time to sit in that literature, to sit in those conversations and almost taste the bittersweetness. It's bitter in that there are so many, unfortunately, that have not had the experience that I had having both of my parents in the house, but the sweetness of knowing that I did. And then turning that into the drive of, trying to find ways to be a father figure to those that are in that unfortunate grouping of Black men who don't know their fathers, or now just people that don't know their fathers. And so anytime I can be a role model or be a source of wisdom or a source of care to today's young people is an opportunity that I'm happy to jump into. And I think that that's a real big part of why working for the National Speech and Debate Association, but also just volunteering as a speech and debate coach prior to working for the NSDA has been so powerful for me. The opportunity not to have what I didn't have, but rather to pay forward what I did. So, for me, trying to be a good coach, trying to be a good educator, trying to be a good colleague, trying to be a role model for me, it is definitely me attempting to pay homage to my dad while also trying to honor my mother who is still here and is still kicking.
Yeah. I think that's totally part of the meaning making, part of this bifurcation point of, like you're saying, you take in all this literature, these stories that are being told, this narrative that's really frequent, that is becoming more known, that this is more frequent for a lot of people in the Black community, of missing out on those father figure roles, and that you could kind of decide, what meaning do I make out of that story? Where do I go from there? And I think it's a testament to you that you can lean into the complexity of it, of that bittersweet, not just go the direction of bitter, not just go the direction of sweet, because the CMM theory, like the criticism is that it's too complicated, like people can't understand it. And so that's part of my goal, is to make it more accessible. But really, it has to be so complex because life is really complex.
Yeah, it is not cut and dry.
If it's trying to accurately in any way make sense of life, it has to be complex. And so I really value that skill of being able to lean into the complexity of life, especially because I would say I grew up with the narratives being very black and white, right and wrong, like there was not gray area. I was not taught. That's like a later in life thing for me that I've had to teach myself more or learn more about. Wasn't something that I grew up with, that ability to lean into like harder conversations or harder experiences that are not, like you said, not cut and dry.
I think it's a lot easier now than it was for children of my generation, the kind of late Gen X, early millennial, for where we sit, for those of us in our early to, I can't believe I say this out loud, mid 40s. I think that there is, for many of us, there is that growing up with kind of almost polar absolutes. Right, wrong, fair, unfair, moral, immoral. Yeah, good, bad, right, wrong, just, unjust, and not necessarily the questioning of, well, I get why some say good, but let's think about like our definition of bad and how those two extremities kind of sit and look at each other, and all of this big giant space in the middle. For those of us that are Gen Xers and older, I feel like that is the world that we did not get a chance to have as children. It was, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And now it's yes, gender is so fluid
right,
now,
even
so,
that.
Can you even say sir or ma'am anymore? Or should you say sir or ma'am anymore? Or what is the alternative? And I'm a big believer in honoring gender identity and fluency and things like fluidity and things like that. So our world is more complex for many reasons. I'm thankful that today's young people get the opportunity to dig into those complexities, to talk about those complexities, to argue about those complexities, and to dissect, to read, to research, to understand, to disagree, to seek more. I always appreciated the liberal arts elements of my education, and all of those things I think are very much related to that.
I agree. And I think having a mindset of like curiosity, to be asking questions and learning how to ask, I won't say the right questions, because again, it's not right, wrong, good, bad, black, white like that, but asking more curious, more thoughtful questions is so important. And I think that's actually a skill that people haven't taken the time to hold in their hand and really look at and pay attention to.
Of course.
Of how do you do this? The way I see it is communication is this like actually very tangible thing now that I've studied it and talked about it a lot and looked at it. But for people outside of, the comm world of studying comm or talking about comm, it feels so abstract. And it's like, why do we think that we'll just figure it out along the way? We're not giving ourselves the best chance if we're not saying, well, actually, there's like real tools and like language, especially for me, like language that can help you understand and express your experiences better to other people. It's just like, I just think everybody deserves to have those tools and that language, because it's a real game changer in my mind.
I think that it is going to be the difference between peace and war. I think it's the difference between love and hate. I think it's the difference between confrontation and resolution. I think it's the difference between calm and chaos. And that is our ability to simply talk to each other and to understand each other, while meanwhile, in that understanding, having an awareness of who we are and who others are. I'm a big fan of the idea of something called multicultural competence, which is derivative of cultural competence, which was introduced in the late 80s in the counseling field, because at one point there were so few, and some would say this is still a reality, that there were so few psychologists and psychiatrists of color in the United States, that people of color in particular had no one that looked like them or talked like them or thought like them to help them navigate mental illness, which even 22 years ago, when that was my persuasion in college, I remember one of the statistics we used was the reality that 0.1% of the United States psychologists and psychiatrists back then were people of color. And that statistic was juxtaposed to the reality that at one point, depression was a top 2 killer of most people of color, or that something related to mental illness or mental strain was the cause, as high as the second leading cause of death for many racial minorities in this country. And so one of the things I really appreciate about multicultural competence is the focus on multicultural awareness, which I like to define as an understanding of how we see ourselves and how we see others. And there's a lot to be said about the way in which my presentation of me can paint a picture and even set the mental table for how someone else sees a man of color, a Black man in particular, in the United States in 2023. Am I perfect? But let's just say no. But I do take time to think through how my actions, my words, the way I construct them, the way that I present them, and the way that I set my own physical actions and behaviors, etc., alongside those words. I do recognize that those things can create the reality of all Black men for other people. I also have to keep in mind that you, for example, as a white woman, you aren't the prototype for all white women. And so for me to have the expectation that every other white woman I encounter is like Abbie Van Meter, I run the very real risk of putting people in a position where all of the idiosyncrasies that make them, all the nuances that make another white woman that particular person, get lost and dashed away. And that's unfair.
I was going to ask, how do you balance that? The word that's coming up for me is this like idea of like a tokenism of like, okay, we've heard Paul's story. Now we've heard the story of all Black men in America, you know, because you're saying that you're aware of this, that you are representative of people that share your identity, or the way, you know, other people interact with you feels like a representative. So yeah, how do you balance that, getting to tell your own story, part of which happens to be the shared identity, with not trying to speak for everyone, I guess?
I think a big part of it is we have to take our time. I appreciate the fact that this isn't a 10-minute conversation, right, and that we are sitting down to engage in conversation and trying to get to know people, because you can't capture 44 years in a couple hours. Obviously, there are things that are getting left out. When we take our time to get to know people, we get to fill in some of those blanks. And it's some of those blanks, it's some of those details that separate us out. You could replace me right now with another Black man, and he might paint for you a completely different story. And someone could hear that and think, but that's not the Black guy that we just heard. How are they not all the same? They're both Black. They're both men. Like, shouldn't they have like identical matching stories? Absolutely not. People are like snowflakes. Even when we look the same, we are dramatically different, but it takes time to hear the differences, to see and experience the differences, to mentally unpack them, to ask questions when we don't understand, to get confirmation, and then to even kind of work those things into our brain. I'm a big fan of Jean Piaget and his idea of the cognitive schema, the way that we organize images in our minds. And in my fandom of Piaget, I liken his theory to the desktop of a computer. If you go to the desktop on your computer, on your laptop, you've got all these folders with pieces of information. You might have pictures, you might have PDFs, you might have PowerPoints, you might have Excel spreadsheets, whatever. And all of those are, if you're like me and you like to have a nice clean desktop, you separate all these things into folders and you label them. Well, the brain kind of does the exact same thing. And if you are also like me and you are too lazy to go and clean out those folders, you have all these images And sometimes you got to sift, you got to do a control F to find exactly what you're looking for to make sense of something specific. If you don't have any experiences, or if you just sift right past them, you don't see all of the little things. I think the bigness of life comes down to the little things. And you'll hear people talk about the little moments, like, where when you're sitting outside with a loved one on a crisp yet still warm fall evening, and you can smell the air, or you can remember the sky, or you can see the sunset. Like, we remember the little things, because in those moments, you don't remember the other 23 and a half hours. You remember those moments of serenity. Or, when people talk about their wedding day or when their child is born, they remember all of the little itty bitty things. And there's so many of those little things that we're going to miss some stuff from time to time, but that doesn't eliminate the need for us to try and pay attention to as much as we can. Because if we just glaze over our interactions with people, if we just glaze over observations, if we just glaze over our moments and experiences, we run the very real risk of putting ourselves in the position where we cannot see the difference. And so not only is it time that we have to spend getting to know people, but also a recognition that every single individual that we meet, every single experience that we have, every single observation that we have, every single place that we go, every single food that we eat, a song that we listen to, all of those things are just little puzzle pieces. And if you put them all together, we get a complete, or a closer to complete picture of the world. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how intricate are we willing to make our puzzle pieces so that we can see all of those little differences and grow to appreciate them? Toure, who is a media critic, newscaster, journalist, etc., he wrote a book in 2011, 2012. And in the book, I believe it is called Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness, he talks about the 40 million different ways that there are to be African American. And what he is essentially saying in that chapter, in that section of his text, is that every African American, every Black person in this country gets to have their own individual identity. And in that individual identity, that is one specific way to be Black. There is no monolith. There is no manual for Blackness. And if you are listening to this and thinking, well, I'm Korean, there's no single way to be Korean. There is no single way to be German. There is no single way to be Irish. It is literally one way, and it's yours. Except my one way and someone else's one way. Now make two ways, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, the theme that's emerging to me is this complexity piece, the complexity of our social world, the complexity of ourselves. And you talked about the multicultural competency. The language that's coming to me is this cosmopolitan communication. That's part of the CMM theory, is that having the ability, which again is a skill, like a practice skill, to know what is true for yourself and exist and be comfortable in the tension between somebody else's experience. That does not, for both to be true at the same time, for all to be true at the same time. Like you said, there 40 million different ways. How many people are on the earth? That's how many different tensions you're going to have to learn to lean into. And again, I think there's so much value in that. Like, I think it's a huge disservice to oversimplify people, to oversimplify anything in the world. You're saying, how small are you willing to get those puzzle pieces? And that's a great metaphor. It's really resonating with me because I actually love to do puzzles. But I'm picturing those that you would do when you were like a child, and there's like 9 pieces and they're like 3 inches tall, each of the pieces. Yeah. And then now I'm like, okay, 500 piece puzzle, 1,000 piece puzzle. And it's like they get smaller. When I do different puzzles, you almost have a different strategy for how you go about the puzzle. And so it is like the questioning process. Like I say it's skills, I say there's tools, but there's not a copy paste method to use for creating the kind of social world you want, creating the relationships that you want. It's every moment of every day, pick up a puzzle piece and figure out what to do with it. And it looks different every time. And you end up with different answers every time. You end up with more questions.
Absolutely.
More puzzle pieces to fit together. That's just my perspective. But what's, becoming clear to me, I think, is probably what I picked up on a long time ago before I even had the language to say it, is that what we share is a communication perspective. Is that, for me, that's the lens that I see my whole life through. And there's, sometimes I take those glasses off and probably put other ones on, but that's definitely the dominant lens.
Well, let me throw one more thing on your puzzle metaphor.
Please.
Because as I was listening to you, I thought, let me throw this curveball at you. In the puzzle that is life, there's no box cover.
Mm-hmm.
I can't flip the box over and look at the finished product, because there is no finished product. And long after we're gone, the puzzle continues to reform and to reshape itself. And that is actually a somewhat perfect example, a pretty decent example of something that we call cultural humility, which is a theory that was written by a couple of pediatricians back in the late 90s. And cultural humility is this idea that suggests that because the world evolves socially, as we learn more, the world is still moving. And by that, I mean that we are socially evolving. So if I, for example, got interested in race relations in the United States 5 years ago, and I read everything about the Black African American diaspora, including every single book, article, documentary, podcast, etc., about race relations in the United States and the Black community's relationship with law enforcement. If I read every single word, every single page, every single minute of every single video, I watched absolutely everything, and I roll through 2020. Now I've got it. I understand. Oh, what do you mean, George Floyd?
Yeah. By the time you've read everything there is to read, there'll be a million more things to read.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you're right. The puzzle metaphor falls apart a little bit here, but if I'm going to run with it, it's like, having no edge pieces, which is always where you start with a puzzle. You want to frame it. And we find ways to do that. But you're right. It's like somebody coming and dumping 500 more pieces on the puzzle just as you're putting the last piece in there. It's a never ending puzzle. So I know we've already touched on Ball State in speech a little bit, but I'd love to hear about how you first got into the world of communication and also why you stayed, like why it sticks with you.
Why I stayed. That's
the real kicker.
That's the kicker. The Paul Porter communication story. It really should be brought to you in part by so many people.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember 3rd or 4th grade taking one of those, we called them the bubble tests, because you were always filling in a Scantron with bubbles, and it was some proficiency test. And I just remember getting the scores back, and it measured us on things like, math, reading comprehension, writing. There was a category, I think it was called written communication. Now, I had scored in the 80s on everything, but then the written communication line just kept going, and it went all the way to 99. And I just remember my parents were explaining it to me, and when they explained it to me, I got all big-eyed, and I'm like, I speak better than every 3rd grader in the country. And they just kind of looked at me and they're like, yeah, whatever. Who knew? Fast forward a few years, a lot of my experience with communication has been by luck and happenstance. I remember being in the 9th grade, and this story is going to tie so many things together. I am on the football team. I'm a wrestler. I guess you could say I'm a good student. I'm an okay guy at that point. I'm good people. I walk into homeroom on the first day in ninth grade. I went to a junior high, by the way. So for me, I went to a school for 7th, 8th, and ninth grade before going to high school. I didn't actually start high school until the 10th grade. I don't know if junior highs still exist anymore. So I walk into school, first day in ninth grade, and I go to homeroom. My homeroom is in the choir room. I only knew it was the choir room because the year before I took my music requirement, and that was a course called general music. I didn't want to learn how to play an instrument. Didn't think we could afford an instrument. I don't like to admit that I can sing, but I got a couple pipes. And so I walk in, and the homeroom that I'm in, I don't know how I fell into it. I still, to this day, do not know how I ended up in this room, but it was actually the homeroom for all the members of our honors choir. We called it swing choir. No idea how I got in there.
Not something you signed up for.
Did not sign up for it because the idea of, and this is back in like the mid 90s.
Right.
So the idea that like the starting left tackle on the football team and the varsity heavyweight wrestler is actually a heck of a baritone. Yeah, that just, we were so wrapped up in just, those silly gendered roles.
Yeah.
That the idea that, the big bad football player is in choir, like, it's going to ruin my reputation.
Well, again, it's an oversimplified
Yes.
label. And I think like labels can be good. And I actually just talked to someone else. We had a huge conversation about labels on the podcast, and that'll come out soon. But the label, that language, I think can be helpful for people. But if you just let it stand on its own, then it's oversimplification. So what's the label? And then it's again asking the questions, well, what does that mean to you?
Right.
And what meaning do you attach to it? Why can't the, person on the football team and the person that's a wrestler also be in choir? What's the meaning that we're attaching that makes those things mutually exclusive?
And here's the scary thing about these superficial simplifications. Remember, I was in the ninth grade. I was 14. And these thoughts were deeply embedded.
Yeah.
And I bet you, Abbie, that if you could somehow take like a mental saw and cut my skull open and go deep into my brain, somewhere they're still there.
Yeah.
Which is the really super hard part about living in a diverse world is that, when you're 44, am I 44? Yeah. When you're 44, there are things from 30 years ago that are back here somewhere.
Yeah.
That can creep up front if you're not careful. And so we constantly have to be in thought to make sure that some of the not so great images and thoughts and perspectives in our mind don't creep up and take over. So the interesting thing about my homeroom was that it had 2 extracurricular activities attached to it. One was the honors choir. 2 was this thing called WFJH, W Fulton Junior High. And it was the morning announcements. We had a camera. Remember, it's like 1993.
Yeah.
We have a camera on a tripod. And somebody has created this news desk. And so we really think that we are like Barbara Walters and freaking, I thought I was, Walter Cronkite. We really thought we were doing something.
Yeah,
It was actually almost like this home video that we would then record the morning announcements. Somebody would take the tape to the principal's office, put it up on a screen. And I hadn't gotten to do it yet. I hadn't gotten to do the news yet. And so when it was finally my turn and I was asked what I wanted to do, I said, I want to do sports because, I'm an athlete. I love sports.
Yep.
And so I start doing it, and I put so much personality into reading a good luck message to the girls' volleyball team. I walk out of homeroom, and everyone at school is like, go get them, girls. Because at one point, that was like something that I said. So it becomes this thing. Teachers are talking about it. Students are talking about it. I was invited to the girls' volleyball game that night just to like lead people in this cheer of go get them, girls. It became this thing. And you know this just like I do. When you go to a big high school, it's easy in those big giant spaces to get lost. And much like your high school, my school district, everybody was good at something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had finally found like my thing I could be good at. Also, because I thought we'd put the whole singing thing away, I auditioned for the honors choir just as a joke, literally as a joke. I go into this back room with our choir director and I just sing the 8 bars, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And he stops and he looks at me and I thought we were going to like laugh at it and make a big thing. And he's like, oh, wait, you can sing. And like that became like this evolving thing that I worked through all the way through high school. Doing the morning announcements in the 9th grade got me thinking about my future. And when I saw the attention and the excitement that literally a 14-year-old saying, go get them, girls. When I saw what that created, I started to really work at it.
Yeah.
I went home. I was a news watcher when I was a kid. I remember being as early as like 1st or 2nd grade, Abbie. When I was in elementary school as a latchkey kid, my mom worked at night. My dad would go get my mom and pick her up from work. And so I was basically in charge of getting up in the morning, getting myself dressed, grabbing my lunch money off of the dining room table, and going to the bus. As young as like 6, 7 years old, I would watch the local news. And so when I got this opportunity to do these morning announcements, I drew back to the morning news. But instead of now just watching it for the sake of watching it, I can't, by the way, listen to the Iran-Contra affair the same way. Because I'm like, I remember being like 8 years old and like watching it. I would like go to school. I would like go to school and be like, so what do you think about this Iran-Contra affair? And like my 2nd, 3rd grade teachers are like, are you talking about? So now I'm in like the, 9th grade. I'm like watching the news and I'm taking notes and I'm learning about like transitions. I'm learning about how to move like tone and pacing from one story to another. And I remember one day I was the main newscaster and I'm sitting next to the sports guy and I'm literally like doing my stories and stuff like that. And I get to a point where I'm like, hey, and Steve, hey, man, in sports, is a tough game for the Falcons last night, huh? And everyone in the room's like, what? And they asked me, like, where did that come from? And I said, man, I was watching the morning news. That, like, they do that because that's what they do.
Yeah.
My high school had a radio station. Shameless plug, 90.9 WBDG, Indianapolis. And I took the mass media course and I got onto the radio staff. And from there, it was just, we're off to the races. It was something that I absolutely loved, really enjoyed. Had an after school show on Friday afternoons. I got to do commentary and play-by-play for basketball games, things like that. And I will never forget my junior year on a Saturday. I come in to do a Saturday afternoon radio show. Usually it's difficult to get into my high school. It's a big high school. And so I walk into my high school, lights are on. There's a lot of hustle and bustle. And there are a lot of people in suits and dress clothes. And a bunch of them are talking to walls. Could not understand why. I run into a buddy of mine. His name's Eddie Conkle. I run into him and I ask him what's going on. He's like, oh, man, it's a speech tournament. I'm like, wait a minute, what? He's like, yeah, man, speech team. I was talking to you about speech team a while ago. And I'm like, yeah, man, I thought you were just a dork. And when he explained it to me, I thought, oh, this is cool. But seeing all that life, seeing all that energy, seeing all that fun, was attractive to me. My senior year, when I'm done playing football and I come to the realization that, I'm not going to play football in college. I remember I go to our speech coach, this guy named Max McQueen, legendary high school speech and debate coach in Indiana, Hall of Fame coach. I go to him and I say, Max, I don't know what speech team is, but I'm going to be on it. He thought I was just, pulling his chain. I bugged him all summer because I went to summer school every summer. And I kept saying, hey, can I do some practicing or something like that? And he's like, yeah, whatever. I don't think he did not think I was serious. First day of my senior year of high school, I go to him and I walk in and I sit down in his office, sit down in his classroom rather. And he says, "What do you need, Paul?" And I said, "I would like to be on the speech team. May I please join the speech team?" And he just looks at me and says, "Oh, you were serious?" In my mind, talk about meaning. For me, competition means preparation.
Mm-hmm.
All year round conditioning in the weight room, the running and the jumping and the, conditioning your bodies, taking care of your bodies, meetings and conversations and things like that. Even reading materials that our coaches would give us to get us thinking about how we take care of our bodies, how we take care of our minds, how we are good citizens, and how all of that gets wrapped up in sport. And so for me, if I'm going to do something competitively, it's just like football. It's preparation, it's practice, it's consistent thinking about what it means to be part of this activity. And so I wanted to jump into that as soon as the season was over. It was a sectional tournament, by the way, so I knew that I couldn't join the team my junior year when I found out about it. But I knew that I could, in my mind, I thought, well, I can start preparing for next year's this summer. I'm going to prep. I'm going to practice. I'm going to learn. And I'm going to be great when the season starts. And when I found out that radio was an event, I thought I'm going to be the greatest thing in the history of speech and debate.
Yeah.
And the funny thing, Abbie, is that the path that I thought I was carving for myself when I was 17, I honestly think I think I have actually ended up where I thought I was going to end up. So when I was this like big talker thinking that I was going to rule the world, I think I got exactly where I wanted to go. And I think that's why I stuck around. I started doing speech and debate my senior year of high school. That year was magical. I was a state finalist. I was a 2-time national high school finalist. I went on to college to be on the speech team at Ball State University. Those are the 4 greatest years of my life. For all the trials, all the tribulations, all the laughs, all the tears, all the good, all the bad, all the lessons learned, the easy way and the hard way. I wouldn't give up my time at Ball State University or my time on the Ball State speech team. I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. I am not the human being that I am today if I hadn't gone to Ball State and hadn't been coached by some outstanding human beings that not only cared about me, but knew how to go upside my head and metaphorically grab me by the scruff of the neck. I had people that gave me tough love. I had people that gave me kindness. I learned what inclusion meant because of speech and debate. I'm thinking of a line that I said. I did a keynote at a prestigious debate tournament back in December. The Blake School in Minneapolis, Minnesota, hosts a debate tournament, very prestigious debate tournament every December. And they host a DEI conference, the back end of the tournament. And I was asked to be the keynote this past year. And I think back to something that I said during that keynote. I said that I love speech and debate. And it is one of the first things that ever unconditionally loved me back. Doing speech and debate introduced me to comm studies. As you can probably guess from piecing together my little mini life story, I went to Ball State because their mass media program, back then telecommunications, is a highly regarded and still a highly regarded major. I was going to go and I was going to graduate and I was going to be on the Today Show 5 days after graduation, and I should be a billionaire by now. And I don't know why that hasn't happened. Yes, I do. Because it really wasn't where I was meant to be. I was more concerned about being on the speech team. That was my focus. That's what made me happy. Being on the speech team, doing speech and debate made me happy. And being in the old AC building, the Arts and Communications building, running those hallways, I met a lot of the comm studies faculty. And I got really interested in who they are and what they did and what they taught. And I kind of felt left out that I didn't have these relationships with them. People like Beth Mesner or Marcy Meyer.
Yeah.
The Laura O'Hara. I didn't have those types of relationships with them, Glenn Stamp and others. But I wanted those. I really did, because they were you could just tell that they were good and caring people. They are good and caring people, by the way.
They are, and
Still.
I got to experience them. And it's the same for me that I actually started as political science when I went to Ball State.
I didn't know that.
Well, it was short-lived, very less than a semester, because my immediate thought was these people are the worst. There's a lot of nuances that made me say that. Probably some of that lack of curiosity and question asking and open-mindedness. And then I found myself in the common department. I said, well, the reason I stay is because these people are the best. And there's a lot of, layers to what I mean when I say that. But they really are some of the greatest people. And I feel very similar of it is not an overstatement when I say I owe so much of who I am and how I am to speech.
When I said that I love speech and debate, and it is one of the first things that ever loved me back. I love that comm department, and they loved me back, and they had every reason in the world not to. They took a chance on me when I gave them every reason not to. I think it would be safe to say I was a handful to deal with. And a lot of that, and I didn't know it then, I know it now, was tied to mental illness. I did not realize some of the mental health struggles that I had when I was younger, that I realized them now. I went to my first therapy session. I saw a psychiatrist for the first time. I remember. I saw a psychiatrist when I was 35, and that's when I learned about ADHD, learned what it really is. That's when I learned about what depression was. That's when I learned about what anxiety was. I didn't know what those things were. I remember when I got diagnosed with those things, I looked a psychiatrist dead in the face and I said, really? I thought I was just a jackass. And that's what I would project out to people. Talk about making, our organization and construction of meaning. I could just explain it all away by being this character that was, just a goof off. And really what I was doing was I thought I was hiding who I was and trying to project what people wanted. And the faculty in the comm department at Ball State saw right through it. But the interesting thing is that very few of them called it out. They just accepted me for who I was trying to be. Well, I think also longing to see who I actually was and who I could be. I think part of the reason I am so proud to give back to Ball State is because I get to show them who I was all this time. And just didn't know it. Really didn't. I stayed in the discipline because of the people. I went to graduate school, went to Eastern Michigan. I learned how to be a speech team coach. I learned a little bit about how to be an administrator. I was taught by some great scholars and by some great administrators. I knew that I wanted to go into administration at some point, but I also knew that I wanted to be a professor. And I knew that for a long time. While I was at Ball State, something in my heart said. And I remember the first time that Karma Schwager, don't know where she is, wherever she is, I hope she's doing okay. She was my academic advisor. And she sat with me and she said, have you ever thought about being a professor? Because what she knew for me was that I really, 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 really wanted to coach a speech team. And she said, well, why don't you become a professor? Have you ever thought about being a professor? And in my mind, I thought, I'm just a big goof off. I can't be a professor. And I remember she looked at me and she said, no one's buying your act, Paul.
Whoa.
And that's, I think, when it really started to hit me that, I grew up in a neighborhood that isn't the greatest neighborhood. I mean, it's home and I love it, but it's not in the best economic shape. There aren't $2 million houses in my neighborhood. And so living in that neighborhood, college was a pipe dream for many of us, let alone getting paid by one to be a professor. That for me was groundbreaking. To go and actually to do that, to teach college courses, to be called professor. I remember my mom still to this day, my mom calls me Dr. Porter. She is so proud of that. I don't think she understands what any of it means, but.
Well, we'd have to ask her, what meaning did she make of it?
You know what? I will.
Good.
I will. I only left comm studies because I left faculty life And I went on to pursue administration. And my PhD is actually in educational leadership from Indiana State with a focus on higher education. And so I studied how colleges work. And I found myself in many instances drawing upon my OrCom knowledge, my rhetoric background, because I really focused on public address and rhetoric in graduate school with a little intercultural communication doodling around the edges. I got to use some of my sociology background, which if you think about it, those sociology and interpersonal are so part and parcel. I was able to use the things that I learned and then found this really cool intersection, because it was really during my PhD program that I got to really sink my teeth into DEI and multiculturalism the way that I wanted to.
I'll say that my experience with speech seems very similar to yours. My only divergence is now at this point where I've kind of left this world of speech. It's something that sticks with me. Mm-hmm. But you've been in the world of speech for 25 years now?
I'd say on and off for 26, but I'd also say that, I left for a while too.
Yeah.
I've never been a head speech coach, never been a head coach. I've had opportunities, never happened. And, when I started to really get into my career, I realized that the direction that I saw myself going in probably was not going to include speech and debate. And so I got away a little bit. And certainly when I realized that I wanted to study how colleges work and I wanted to study experiences of students, particularly students of color on a college campus, I threw myself into that study. I stopped going to the National Communication Association conference, and I started going to conferences on student affairs and on student enrollment and student engagement and stuff like that. And so I left for a while, and I worked at a small university in Indianapolis for a little bit, Marian University. And I remember when they built a speech team, when they started a speech team, and I thought, I'm going to come back. And then even then it didn't happen. And I really grew comfortable with being the guy that had a speech and debate background, but wasn't affiliated with the speech team. And I didn't think I'd ever come back. I really didn't. I got my PhD. I moved out to Pennsylvania. I worked at the University of Scranton, ran a multicultural center, and left only because there was an opportunity in Indianapolis to work at the IU Med School and serve as their director of diversity programming and assessment. And that's when I got so caught up in my career that I needed something in addition to my work. And I remember seeing a therapist, and my therapist said, you need a hobby. Like, you need something to do. And I remember her asking me a question like, what do you like to do when you're not working? And I thought, it's usually when I go to the bathroom and sleep. That's what I do. I go to the bathroom and I sleep. That's what I do when I'm not working. And I just remember her asking me, are there things in your life that you enjoy? Like, what do you like? What do you like to do? What are your hobbies? And since she told me I needed a hobby. And ironically enough, it's interesting the way the stars align sometimes. I got a call from a speech coach at my alma mater that said, hey, we've got these two kids that are going to nationals, and would you come watch them do a performance? And I watched them and I gave them some feedback, and it was cool for what it was. It was just me popping in to watch a couple kids from my high school. And when they got back from the national tournament, that coach called me and said, why don't you want to get in on this? You want to like coach a little bit? And it's funny, I still remind him of this. He said, you could, come in and coach a couple days a week, go to a tournament a month. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I should have known. And I just fell back in love with it. Yeah. And so that's the thing that I would tell anybody that maybe leaves an activity, leaves a first love. You can always come back to it. And I threw myself back into it. Really, really enjoyed it. I got a chance to coach events that I hadn't thought about in years. That's how I found my way back and through it. And then, as I started to find pathways and opportunities to let my DEI work interplay with my speech and debate work, that's where I found opportunities to lend voice to our state's leadership in terms of the association, the Indiana School Speech and Debate Association, how to give people my own perspective and insight on DE&I and how we can use speech and debate as an avenue for, engaging young students of color, creating opportunities and pathways to retention and graduation, building skills to go to college and be successful in college, develop careers, things like that. Now it's just those two things are so deeply intertwined with me and who I am and what I love and what I value that I it's hard to think of one without the other.
Especially over the past couple of years, I think a lot of people would recognize DEI, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but maybe don't have a more in-depth understanding of it. Can you explain what it means to you, at least?
So one thing I like to do, and I appreciate this question, and anybody that knows me would hear that question and think, yeah, that's Paul's question. When it comes to DEI, I'm a big fan of definitions. And I'm a big fan of definitions because we need them in order to give structure and frame of reference to what those words mean. We all know how to use those buzzwords.
Right.
We all know how to, as my mother would say, talk the BS. And we know how to say them and sometimes not know what they mean.
Right.
And so for me, the definitions are really important. I define diversity as the presence of different individual and intersecting identities. I think of equity as a commitment, a shared commitment to conditions of fairness in the processes and procedures of an organization. I like to think of inclusion as a commitment to involving and uplifting diverse perspectives. So it is I think of inclusion as the sharing of space with all. I have to use those definitions so that when I talk about DE&I, the people have an understanding of exactly what it is that I mean. I'm not just talking about equity so that I can sound like I'm in the know, but rather it's important to me that people know that I'm talking about the idea of shared conditions for organizational fairness.
Those are helpful definitions, I think, because they have come to be buzzwords in a lot of ways. And I think there are a lot of concepts or words that are really helpful, again, when you can look at the complexity of them and look at the layers of them, but have kind of been reduced down to just buzzwords. Something I'm curious about what you have to say on the idea of how do we promote, or I don't know what verb you would use, but how do we reflect that we have those values out into the world on a personal level and on an organizational level? Because you're doing that for your job now, being the DEI director for the NSDA. But how do we do that on like a personal level too?
I think very similarly, I'm going to add one more word, and that word is multicultural. And that word has done a lot for my conceptual framework when it comes to the DEI work that I get to do. I think that speech and debate is a multicultural activity. And when I say that, I mean that it is an activity that invites and holds space for so many different identities. A lot of people hear the word diversity and they just think of race, or what I call the big three: race, gender, and sexuality.
Yep.
But it's much more than that. It's race and it's gender and it's sexual orientation, but it's faith tradition, it's body type, it is different abilities, it's nationality, it's political preference, it's geographic location. Because, the experience that you might have had in a suburban setting different than what I had in an urban setting. It's education level, it's economic status, it's all of these different things because they all beget different realities. And to parse them down to just a couple, I think it's unfair.
Yeah.
It stifles the whole 40 million conversation that we had earlier.
Yeah. I almost want to think about it like when I hear the word diversity, or when I use the word diversity, I want to put like diversity parentheses of experience. And that would be when you have two people in a room, you have a diversity of experience. They might have some similarities, but it's like the more people you can get to the table, the more diversity of experience you'll have, which can encompass all of those, like you were saying, all those identities. that some people might have shared experiences within. But if we can say diversity and think diversity of experience, then that, to me, for me at least, adds some of those layers back in that I feel like have been taken away by the overuse of the word.
I also think that people will say that diversity is divisive. And I will ask, why? And they'll say, well, when you're talking about diversity, you are actually leaving some people out, because when we talk about diversity, and sometimes I'll stop them and say, hold on, let me make this easy for you. When we're talking about diversity, we mean Black people. Yes. I mean, no, but kinda. And I'm like, yeah, if you want to think of it as that restrictive, but if you want to think about it from a multicultural perspective,
right?
What we've just said is that everyone is going to get invited to this table, because just because you're white doesn't mean that you can't have mental illness, or just because you are a male doesn't mean that you have to be heterosexual. And so if you think about it, we all bring something to the DEI conversation. We all bring something to this big, massive salad bowl that is the world to beget diversity. Would some say that that's an aspirational line of thought? Absolutely. I just think it's the reality of the world, that while you may only have one thing to offer, you have something to offer. And I think that it's just wrong to leave people out. So it's almost like eating a salad. If you go to a salad bar, and I used to do this when I was a kid, traditionally when we think of a salad bar, you start with lettuce, and lettuce is usually the majority of a salad. If you just eat a bowl of salad, that's boring. But if you just have a bowl of toppings, that can be overwhelming. And you are missing something. And what you're missing is the majority. And so I think that having all of those things come together, but then positioning all of those things to work in concert to create this richness that is the benefit of diversity, that to me is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and be explicit and say that white people are the lettuce. And I think specifically white men in the United States is what I'm thinking of, is that the reason that I think it probably what you hear mostly is people who are white being the people who feel maybe threatened or uncertain about DEI work is because we've taken for granted that there will be space for our voices to be heard.
Yeah.
And so it takes empathy, it takes imagination, curiosity to put yourself in the position of, what if that wasn't the case? What if that wasn't a given? And I think just because I'm loving our metaphor use, going to go down the salad metaphor a little further, is that people like different things on their salad. Right. Everyone has lettuce.
Right.
Everyone has lettuce.
Right.
But what else gets to be a part of the, salad of society or whatever? It's like, it's not a pie. It's not percentages of a whole.
Right.
Where you being able to tell your story takes away from me being able to tell my story. It is endless supply. It's this, I've heard people talk about a scarcity mindset, and we think about that with like real tangible resources, but also I think kind of socially, the space that we have, I have to hoard it up for myself so that I can protect my story from being told. But really, if I not even step back, but just step to the side so that someone else can also step up and share their story, again, it's richer, it's more flavorful if I'm still talking about the salad, I guess, but like it's the taking for granted the people who have had the power, who have been the default to feel threatened, but it's the difference. And I think like Brene Brown is someone who I know who's like used this language, but it's the difference between like power over versus like power with, maybe is the language she uses. I'm not a great expert on that, but it's like there is room. And that's a huge part of the CMM theory too, of like when you look at stories and you look at the stories that are lived, the stories that are told, right? Name of the podcast. But then in between, all these other stories, the ones that aren't told, the ones that aren't heard, the ones that we can't tell, the ones that, the list is really endless of all the stories in between.
Right.
So we have to look at, why haven't those stories been heard? Why hasn't that person felt like they could tell their story? I feel like that's what DEI work is about.
I think also I'm going to throw in another metaphor that I use, and that's the tried and true place at the table. And I've had people say before, well, Paul, if I have 8 chairs at the table and there were 7 white people at the table, but you want to bring in 4 people of color, what do I do? Do people sit on do people sit on each other's laps, or what do I do? Does someone sit on the floor? I mean, like, what do you do when you've only got 8 chairs and there's one open, but you want to bring 4 people in? What do you do? And my response is, get a bigger table.
That's what I was going to say. Build a bigger table.
And it's sad that we have to tackle this. Diversity isn't about silence.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually about us all getting louder.
Together, yeah.
You are adding more sound. And if there's a majority, think of that as the foundational sound.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the sound that's always been there. My story shouldn't silence your story.
Yeah.
My story with your story creates a conversation. One of my inspirations is a guy named Lee Moon-Hwa. There are 2 things that he oftentimes says in his trainings that have always stuck with me. One is a quote from Mother Teresa when she says that perhaps the reason we have no peace is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. The second one, and this is straight from Lee Moon-Hwa, he would say that we are only but one conversation from the relationship that changes the rest of our lives.
Mm.
That conversation can take place when my story comes into contact with your story. And as long as we remember that I'm sharing my story, well, she's sharing her story. Okay, so let's listen to each other's stories. Let the learning and the awareness and the conversation happen. Heaven forbid we bring a third person into that conversation. The conversation gets bigger.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily, well, you have to be quiet, white people, so that the black folk can talk, as much as it is, let's hold space for everybody, because I'm going to get my turn too. And you're right. We have this scarcity mindset. We compete against each other. We have this thing called the oppression Olympics, which is where we have this competition for who is being the most disadvantaged. And at the end of the day, we're all disadvantaging ourselves because we are not taking time to hear each other, care about each other, and recognize that we've all got our nonsense. And if we can hear each other, we can help each other.
I think the point about the table points to it being an issue with the system.
Yeah.
And it even goes back to this questioning that we talked about really early on that's really necessary, because we've got the hand-me-downs of systems that were created hundreds of years ago.
That weren't created for some of us.
Right. They were not created for everyone. And like you said, what your generation didn't get was that questioning. And so some of these systems have gone unquestioned for centuries.
Right.
And it's very uncomfortable and it's very hard and it's a very complex thing, but it is worth doing the questioning, the looking into to say, does this actually work for us anymore? I want to say, just build a bigger table. And it's one of those things where it's like what it looks like to actually, quote unquote, build a bigger table.
You are so right.
Is so big and scary.
Yeah.
But in my mind, necessary, because you have to be honest and say, though, this isn't working. This table isn't working for us anymore. It's falling apart.
If you've ever studied social change disruption, it is just how it sounds. It is the idea of disrupting the status quo for the greater good. And I think that while it's easy to talk about movements and protests, we saw the summer of 2020 is the perfect example of individuals disrupting the status quo. And I don't think that what anyone realized was that entire time, those that were demonstrating and protesting and marching and singing and yelling and screaming, what they were trying to do was to get those who are controlling those systems, who have benefited from those systems, who have inherited those systems without necessarily earning the privileges that come with those systems, to disrupt themselves. And to step back and say, how are we going to dismantle the system that benefits me? That is, I think, the hardest part about the sustaining of those systems and the questioning that some of us have had to learn how to do, because we may struggle with the idea that we are going to disrupt that which continues to give us systemic wealth, economic wealth, sociological power and status, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Using this language from coordinated management of meaning of a better social world being the goal, always the goal. We're always working towards a better social world through the lens of DEI. What is a better social world? And what do we need to do to get there?
I think a better social world is a world in which everybody can exist, live their authentic lives, and not have to justify it. I think a better social world is a world in which we see things that we don't understand, and we are just caught in curiosity and wonder. And we can go to someone and say, I've never smelled food like that. What is that? Oh, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, I've always thought those foods to be gross, but like, what is it that you like about them? Oh, okay, cool. Enjoy your meal. That's awesome. It's really, really interesting. It's such a unique smell. Or to see somebody type something on social media and think, would have never saw that perspective, but all right, cool. Can appreciate that. I think the first step is that we have to stop being afraid of each other. I have a therapist right now that often tells me that this process is going to be a lot harder before it gets a lot easier. And you're going to feel a lot worse before you feel better.
Yeah.
And I think that the first thing we have to do in order to get to the future is we have to sit in the past. I'm a big believer in history because it's stories lived and stories told. And we're silencing stories right now. We have to listen to people's stories. We have to listen to our community's stories. We have to sit in the guilt of those stories. We have to sit in the pain of those stories. We have to recognize that we weren't there and that there has been social corruption. There has been political corruption. There has been racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia and Islamophobia, white privilege, male privilege, Christian privilege, economic privilege, educated privilege, body privilege. I could go on and on and on. We have to sit in the reality that these things have existed, that they have benefited some, that they have disadvantaged others. We have to come to the conclusion that it's not a coincidence that there are these economic gaps, that there are housing disparities, that there are educational disparities, that there is pay inequity. And then, we could start by saying, I'm sorry. We could start by not just sitting and watching people's pain, but have a little empathy and have a little sympathy. And look someone in the face and care about them enough to not want to see people feel that way again. And maybe then we can all sit down at one big giant table with a big giant bowl of salad and ask ourselves, how are we going to fix this? What are we going to do? And sometimes that's going to mean, the laundry lists of different ways in which those disadvantages and those disparities are still in existence, and that one by one we got to tear them down. And maybe we have to ask ourselves the question, are we cool enough with the reality that if we care about each other, we can all win? It is certainly possible. Again, altruistic, aspirational. Is it realistic? I don't know if we will be here to ever know. One of my favorite poems was written in honor of the great Oscar Romero, now Saint Oscar Romero. He was the Archbishop of San Salvador in the 1970s, 1980s. I visited El Salvador a few years ago, and it is a place in the world that will always be close to my heart. The last lines of the poem are, we are workers, we are not master builders. We are ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. It is the poet's way of saying that we are doing work or an end result that we won't be here for.
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? Think about all the people in history that we've learned about: Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, Dorothy Day. They're not here. Was their struggle worth it? Black man talking to a white woman on a podcast where we're sharing our stories and listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to think that Dr. King or Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael would watch this and say, okay, maybe we're getting somewhere. Now, some of them might say, no, we're getting somewhere if this is on the up and up and she doesn't harm his words. And now, Barbara Jordan might roll through and say, she's going to have a black woman on her next.
I've been thinking a lot about imagination lately in terms of, I used the word empathy earlier, of like, you have to have imagination to have empathy. You have to use your imagination. And that's something that I think adults at least don't think about themselves as living in their imagination. It feels like maybe a childish thing or not like a really functional thing, but everything came from somebody's imagination.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's okay for us to be in this imaginative space right now.
Yeah.
Which is what I am asking when I say, what does a better social world look like? And how do we get there? We don't have the answers. It's not happening today. It's not happening tomorrow. It's not happening in the next 10 years, 50 years. Who knows, but it is happening in our imagination. And that's what starts it down the path to becoming a reality.
Mm-hmm.
All of these people you listed, there are things that if they're on a podcast,
right,
they'd be saying, this is the kind of world I imagine, but that's probably not a reality.
Dr. King said it the night before he died.
Yeah, but there are things that they would have said weren't a reality that are a reality now, or are at least a step closer to being more of a reality. Again, it is, the better social world, that leaning into that complexity, leaning into the idea that there's something bigger than yourself. You're a part of something bigger than yourself. This world, this social world that we're in. And like I don't know, I'm struck by all of these kind of seemingly small moments that you pointed out in your story that have stuck with you. And I feel like that's a good micro example of something that also happens on a bigger scale, is that those moments have stuck with you and it shaped you, and you can point to specifically and say, this kind of seemingly insignificant thing, I got placed here for homeroom. I had this professor, this person said these couple words to me.
Yeah.
That you can very clearly connect the dots and say, and that is why I am where I am today.
Yeah.
I think that happens on a societal level too, of the little things being the things that we can point back to sometimes too and say, well, that was a game changer, even though in the moment it felt small.
Absolutely. You say imagination, I say dreams. And if you're willing to invest in your dreams, they become this thing called hope. I think for a better social world, we have to have some hope. I made reference to 2020. I think we lost hope because no one should have to die for us to do something about the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is the biggest regret that I have of the summer of 2020. Was that all those statues that came crumbling down, all those sports teams that changed their names, all these companies writing these statements, crafting these strategic plans, and, what now seems a little more normal, which is every time you turn around, you see more racial diversity, representational diversity in groups. Why does somebody have to die? Why did someone have to lose their life for us to say that the idea of a biracial woman being vice president of the United States, that could work? That's an idea. What I would tell every young person listening to this podcast, I would say, get ready because I'm going to tag you in at some point. Because at some point I'm going to slow down. And, at some point you all have to step in. I hope that I have made a little progress so that the work isn't as hard.
Well, I certainly think so. And I think that's a great call to action. Waiting in the wings, kind of like a get ready and get working now. But absolutely, I think that's a great thing to end on. And I really appreciate everything that you have said today. And it's given me so much that's going to stick with me, I think, and things I want to keep thinking about and keep asking questions about and keep learning about for sure. Thanks for your time today, Paul.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it.
I'm glad to do it.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Paul. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which act as next turns. So the conversation doesn't stop when the episode does. You may or may not have noticed that I've been trying to pare these questions down a little bit. I know that asking a large number of questions can feel like a lot. Maybe you don't know where to start in doing your reflecting and it starts to feel like homework. So that is something I'm trying to do. But today I'm going to fail at that a little bit, in part because this conversation used to be 2 episodes. And so originally there are 6 questions that I asked across the 2 episodes. I pared that down a little bit today, but I just thought they were really good questions. So I'm going to ask them all. You can latch on to whichever one's resonating with you as you decide what you want to be reflecting on from this episode today. So here are the questions. What are the real ways we can embrace the complexity of our experiences? How can we let go of a scarcity mindset in favor of a mindset of abundance? In other words, how can we see the stories of others as adding something important rather than taking something away from us? What does it actually look like to make more space for people and their stories? How can we start to build a bigger table? Instead of dismissing our vision as unrealistic or unattainable, how can we learn to use imagination and hope as tools to make our dreams a reality? As always, you're welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections on these questions, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, the website, by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or by commenting on this episode in the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all those places are in the show notes to make it easy for you. The reason that I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue, such an important aspect of CMM. Other great ways to stay in dialogue are to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you'd like to invite into the conversation. And like I mentioned at the top of the episode, take that survey. You're welcome to fill out as many questions as you'd like. Take however long or short you'd like on it. I would just love to continue to be in dialogue with you in that way. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward better social worlds. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links I've provided in the show notes. As of this week, the trailer for the Cosmo Parenting podcast, which I am helping to facilitate, has come out. So definitely check out the Cosmo Parenting Substack, where you can go ahead and subscribe so that when those episodes start airing in January, you will be getting them right in your inbox. And if you're not someone who's parenting, send that along to someone in your life who is. I think these are going to be really meaningful resources that I'm really proud and honored to have been able to be a part of. So I'm looking forward to sharing those, and I hope that you will share those as well. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.